Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 18. Today, we'll discuss strategies for paraphrasing. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need a document to write on, as well as access to one source that you'd like to use for Project 3, your annotated bibliography. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll discuss the role of outside sources in academic composition. We'll then define the term paraphrasing as a way to incorporate outside sources, and we'll also discuss the rhetorical value of paraphrasing. Recalling our previous discussions, we often borrow from sources in our own writing, especially argument-based writing, which is what Project 4 will be, to help with our ethos, to say, okay, maybe I haven't personally gone out there and surveyed a number of people, or I haven't conducted these specific experiments, but someone else has. And so in order to help prove my case, prove my point, serve as evidence to the claim that I'm making or the thesis that I'm making, I'm going to cite and borrow from another source. I'm going to borrow from someone else. And so, of course, this helps with your authority as a writer because it demonstrates that you understand the important voices going on in the conversation. And it also shows that you know what kind of evidence will be most appropriate for your intended audience. To borrow from sources, we have a few different ways that we can go about doing that. Of course, we can directly quote a source. So you'll recall from the article that we read a few weeks back on civil discourse, if we were to include a direct quote there, perhaps it could read something like, in 5 Tips for Creating Civil Discourse in an Era of Polarization, Charles C. Kamasi argues, quote, when we do have our safe, comfortable views directly and thoughtfully challenged, we are often unable to come up with something other than a polarizing response. So we are borrowing his exact words to function as evidence or to say to our audience, look, this helps prove my point. But we are using his exact words, which we've visually indicated through the use of the quotation marks. We can also, of course, summarize a source. So if you find that perhaps more than just a few sentences here or there via a direct quote would speak to supporting your overall point, maybe you say, hey, I'd prefer to summarize an entire article or an entire chapter or maybe even an entire book. You'll want to utilize summaries to borrow from a source. So, for example, in 5 Tips for Creating Civil Discourse in an Era of Polarization, Charles C. Kamasi presents the larger argument that there are 5 critical steps necessary for properly utilizing civil discourse, including avoiding binaries and fence-building language. So, we can see here that we've kind of got 2 extremes going on with borrowing from sources. We have got a very focused, precise method of borrowing from a source by via direct quote. So we are taking a very specific sentence or two from the text itself and lifting the exact words, and we are including those exact words as a quote in our own writing. Or we can broaden our scope and we can reference the entire piece by composing a summary where we identify the main argument and the main means of support typically, as well as the conclusions. So you can see here again, we've got sort of opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of borrowing from sources in how we go about incorporating our own voices, writers, to how specific our focus is. When we move on to paraphrasing, you can sort of see paraphrasing as being this comfortable medium between a direct quote and a summary. So when we paraphrase, that is essentially us as writers putting a chunk of another writer's text into our own words while still communicating the writer's original meaning. Now, when we paraphrase, it's usually not the entire text. It's usually not the entire article. And this is what is a key way to differentiate a summary and a paraphrase. Now, a summary is typically the entire text, so an entire book or an entire article, whereas a paraphrase focuses in perhaps on a single idea or a single section or a single paragraph within an article, a chapter, or a book. So it focuses more in on a specific section, but not so narrow as to hone in on a specific sentence like we might do with a direct quote. I really like the explanations from the Purdue University Online Writing Lab. They have explained it as your own rendition of essential information and ideas expressed by someone else presented in a new form. So it's basically kind of playing the telephone game in a sense, with your readers to say, oh, this is what so-and-so, the source that I'm quoting, this is what they've said about, this particular idea. So again, you're not directly quoting them, you are not using their exact words, but you are, through your own evaluation of the text, saying to someone else, this is what, my source is saying. Now, it's also a legitimate way to borrow from a source, of course, and it's a more detailed restatement than a summary, and it focuses more concisely on a main idea. So, for example, let's say you were talking about immigration, because I feel like that's a more popular topic that I've been seeing um, this semester. So immigration is a huge topic, and we could certainly summarize on that. So let's say you're reading an article that talks about immigration. Well, maybe you don't want to summarize the whole thing, but maybe you find yourself saying, there is a really interesting section talking about immigration trends over the last 20 or 30 years. So if that is what you find most relevant to your own thoughts, to your own work, your own argument, then you say, okay, well, I want to paraphrase this section that talks about the historical trends of immigration over the past 2 or 3 decades. So, of course, you're still looking at the topic of immigration, but you're narrowing it down to looking at one specific concept or idea found under that larger umbrella of an article or a chapter or a book. The paraphrase has a similar structure when using the words of others, and similar in terms to how we might start a direct quote or a summary, or how we might frame that through writing. We first want to begin by introducing the source. Remember that this signals to your reader, hey, we are going to go from my original words and thoughts as the writer that you are reading, and I am going to transition and borrow from someone else's works to support my own argument. So, even though it may seem tedious, we always want to make sure that we are introducing a source whenever we borrow from them. Again, because it serves as a visual signal to the reader, hey, we're going from my own original thoughts to someone else's original thoughts to support my own. So, for example, an introduction might read, in his recent article for the Seattle Times, Charles Camosi. So, even though we didn't include the name of the article here, we still included where it was published and the author's first and last name. And of course, anytime after that, when we reference the work of Charles Camosi, we just only have to refer to him by last name. But since this is the first time that we are introducing him, we want to make sure that first and last names are included. You'll then follow with your paraphrase material. In his recent article for the Seattle Times, Charles Camosi argues that because humans are prone to mistakes and misunderstandings, a partial component for civil discourse is maintaining humility. So, if I were the reader and I were to be going through this article, I should be able to say, and if I'm familiar with the article, I should be able to say, okay, yeah, that is an accurate kind of restating of what Kamasi is saying. And then, of course, you want to include any necessary parenthetical in-text citation. So in this case, because we don't have any page numbers, and you can kind of tell I'm using more MLA here, I've included the author's last name in parentheses. And this also serves as a visual signal to our readers. It says, okay, this is the end of the source's thoughts and their findings and their own original text. Now we are going to transition back to my original text as the writer who you were reading. When we think about the benefits of paraphrasing, I personally like to use paraphrasing more often than not in my writing. I just find it the most helpful, and these are some of the reasons why. Paraphrasing allows you to make clearer connections to your argument and your source's work. When you use a direct quote or you directly quote a writer, you are sort of stuck using the words in which you're stuck using their own words. And while that can be helpful in some rhetorical situations, and if something is especially well written or that certainly drives home your point, you can use that direct quote. But paraphrasing, because you are using your own words, you can more easily make connections in the way that you feel would be most appropriate for your audience to tie back to your own argument or your own ideas. It also provides a better transition from a source's words to your own. Again, because you are able to say, this is what the source is focusing on, this is what they're saying, this is how I find it relevant. Again, you can make those more clear transitions and connections between what someone else is saying and how it applies to your ideas. It also helps you gain a better grasp on another writer's argument. So as you're going through, when you're making sure that you are communicating someone else's ideas effectively and correctly, paraphrasing by putting it in your own words will allow you the opportunity to say, okay, this is how I've understood this writer's argument or this particular section of a text. By paraphrasing and putting it in your own words, it gives you a better opportunity to say, this is how I understand it. It's sitting right in front of me through a paraphrase. Am I communicating a source's work correctly and in the way that they intended it? And finally, it helps make larger connections to the text without having to summarize the text in its entirety. So, again, if you're writing on something like immigration, that's such a big topic and there's so many things that you can cover. You can see how summarizing an entire article or a book even on immigration, there would be so much there that your purpose for citing the piece might get a little lost. So by paraphrasing and allowing you to focus on one specific section, but in a little bit greater detail than a direct quote might uh, allow you to get to, you can still make those connections to say, hey, here's this section in another person's work, here's what they say, and here is how this specifically ties to my overall argument or my overall thoughts. But you also don't get bogged down in perhaps irrelevant detail. So for example, if you're talking about, let's say that your paper focuses on drugs and immigration, right? And most of the book that you're citing talks about immigration reform. So once people are here, how do they go about on their pathway to citizenship? Well, if that's, the majority of the book, you can see how summarizing that might require you to include some irrelevant information, because if your paper is focused more on drugs than on immigration policy reform, summarizing an entire book when all you need to do is paraphrase a section in a specific chapter might confuse your readers a bit. So paraphrasing allows you to narrow in just enough to remove the unnecessary or irrelevant details that a summary might require you to include. But again, you do get a broader scope than saying using a direct quote. Let's now talk about the lecture assignment. So I want you to select one source you plan to use in Project 3, the annotated bibliography. I'd like you to find one section from the text that you believe speaks to your interest in the piece and paraphrase it using the strategies we've discussed. So going back to my example, let's say you're reading a book on immigration and you're looking at it specifically through the lens of drug trafficking. Well, find that one specific section and paraphrase it as you find it is the most relevant or intriguing to your own work. So find a specific section or even paragraph and paraphrase. Let's now discuss the weekly homework. For the weekly homework, you will need to include the Core Lecture 18 summary and assignment, as well as the summary and assignment for a mini lecture of your choice. Now, on the schedule, I know that there is also a Core Lecture 19 listed there as well. However, after reviewing the work that you all have done through the lecture assignments and through the drafts that I've reviewed for Project 2, as well as some of the rough drafts for Project 3, I really think we would just be repeating stuff. So we are going to bypass it. And so you don't have to watch Core Lecture 19. There will not be one available. So you're only required to watch Core Lecture 18 and a mini lecture of your choice and submit summaries and lecture assignments for both of those. So that little change aside, if you have any questions or would like to discuss any of this content in greater detail, please feel free to contact me via Canvas direct messaging. All right, everyone, until next time.